Welcome to the Best Music Podcast with Dan Spencer, where we talk about music and the methods for making music with top performers in the music industry. This week's featured guest is Kevin Harris. Now, Kevin Harris plays a distinctive combination of traditional and contemporary music that seeks to celebrate the musical influences of Thelonious Monk and Miles Davis, intersecting with J.S. Bach, Scott Joplin, and, dig this, the folkloric African rhythms of the Caribbean. DownBeat Magazine writes that Harris's compositions deal with themes of strength, love, courage, and self-awareness, and it's a heavy task he set up for himself, and he meets the challenge gracefully. In 2020, he was nominated by the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum to be a Neighborhood Salon Luminary, with the goal to exchange creative ideas and dialogue with Boston's most innovative and thoughtful luminaries, fostering collaborations and artistic networks while shaping Gardner Museum programming. He is currently on faculty at Berklee College of Music, and he is also an MIT-affiliated artist. Harris thrives on a courageously playful style of communication in music, a style that, in his opinion, well, we'll hear from him in a minute, that requires a very special and sincere habit of listening and an equally patient endeavor to express oneself enthusiastically. He hopes that his performances will also inspire the audience to walk away with a sense of joyful connectedness and community. Participation, Harris says, is what keeps our souls alive. You can check him out on Instagram at Kevin Harris Project. That's KevinHarris Project, and KevinHarrisProject.com. Kevin Harris, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. How you doing?
Doing well. Thanks again for having me, Dan. Appreciate it.
Kevin, right before we hit that red record button, we were about to jump into talking about how art is getting shorter, because I think one of the reasons is quite simply you're in competition with everything else. Like, oftentimes when I'm watching Netflix, I think of like my musical endeavors need to equal the quality of Netflix, because we're all in competition. It's just a competition for people's attention, right? Mm-hmm. And so the quality and the level of attention grabbiness of everything needs to sort of follow with this golden age of entertainment that we're in at the moment. Right, so could you talk a little bit about your philosophy on perhaps shortening songs? I noticed just the two things I listened from you before this interview were both under 4 minutes. And I thought that to be actually found that to be noteworthy. And in the sense, I was like, wow, this guy is thinking through not having an 8, 10, 12-minute composition. And was there any thought process behind that in consideration for the time?
Instinctively, I feel like my answer is no. It just kind of, sometimes when you're creating on the spot, especially live, improvising, a lot of times that you just kind of go with whatever the song is feeling like. There's a certain amount of content that's kind of coming through you, and you play that. And sometimes that lasts 4 minutes. I mean, there's plenty of content out there that I've recorded, and also just, live recordings with longer groups where plenty of those songs go like 15 minutes, I even remember one of my records, one of the Jazz Times critics put something like, enjoyed the content, but like they were a little long, and to, address the bigger, topic that we're talking about, I think it's okay to have that balance. I'm not, I do feel like sometimes, yes, a lot of it has to do with attention span and things, society itself just kind of seemingly moving faster, but technically not possible, but at the same time, there's a lot of content out there. What's available, kind of stimulating, inspiring content where lots of time and thoughts gone into it. There's lots of that out there. And to your point, per just media and all these different levels of it, it's much more available. We see much more of it. To offset that, there's like a lot of content that's not as stimulating and probably not as inspiring, and there's like loads of that. So, how do you kind of just get your stuff out there? I mean, another topic is, of course, how do you compete and get all that? I'm not really the best at, thinking about how that works, but I do feel like a lot of my own heroes, probably a lot of our own heroes, just really focus on the craft itself, and that tends to, be a big part of, rising above the fray, if you will.
Something else I wanted to ask you about, and this actually has to do with a new project you're releasing in the fall of 2022 called Shift, is you had a version of what is now a jazz standard, Impressions. Mm-hmm. But the approach to it almost made me want to cry because it was so fresh. It was like when you go to a taco place and there's like this salsa verde that someone made like 5 minutes ago. And yeah, sure, like maybe the recipe came from grandma, right? But the spin and the flavor that gets put on it sort of breathes not a new life to say that the original, presentation of it did not have life, but a new approach. And like jazz should be alive, and it should be a conversation, and it should move, and it should grow. And watching you do that in real time was so exciting and honestly so much fun, because on top of that, the approach of, and I'm not exactly sure what you were doing, but it was like sometimes like the chord, you have this musical voice where it's like you have these particular sort of approaches to some voicings and some bass movements with the left hand that seem to be consistent through some of your music. So can you maybe talk a little bit about your thoughts? Well, I mean, that was just like a word salad, but groove with me here. Like your thoughts on, number one, how jazz can and perhaps should be a living conversation that evolves naturally and changes. But I suppose, it doesn't matter. We don't need to dissect definitions here. But then also how you like to be distinctly yourself, and how your music, I mean, is such a representation of the way you carry yourself in interviews and the way you speak, and it's like a reflection of the way you think. It's like, please just go ahead. I've been talking long enough.
No, it's fine, man. I mean, well, with that excerpt that you're talking about, I think I sent you like an audio track of myself and Fabio Rojas, who's a drummer, on this project called Shift, where the album will be coming out. Wonderful drummer. I met him in Boston. He's in Queens now, in New York, and we've been collaborating and playing. So we recently recorded this album called Shift in Brooklyn, and we've been performing it in New York and Boston. Shameless plug, we have one coming up at the Cordoba Museum in August, so that should be a blast. It'll be the two of us. But to that kind of bigger improvisational point that you make, especially when there's no bass player in this particular project, my left hand, to the best of its ability, does have to kind of step up and hopefully do its job. But like, for me, having grown up in Lexington, Kentucky, a lot of the opportunities I had to play, there was no bass player in a lot of those, so learning how to walk a bass line early, especially a lot of black gospel music, is like really important, in the same way that, you got to have a good left hand. Piano players, especially historically, from stride players all the way up until, there's great duet projects that happen now. The left hand, just being able to kind of walk and keep people on the dance floor, as my mentors would tell me all the time, and I find myself doing to my students, just make sure that left hand keeps people on the dance floor. So, there's a philosophy there, and that, again, that audio that I sent you of Impressions, which actually isn't going to be it's not going to be on the album as Impressions. It was that version inspired something else that ended up being an original.
Oh, so cool.
Yeah, and it sounds pretty good too. So I think we ended up naming that one Plap Top. That's another story. Completely different interview, man. But yeah, so that creative process of just kind of the unfolding of a composition is really interesting. I think a lot of our heroes, or at least my heroes, have done so much homework. You can hear kind of the beginning of their development as an artist. Take Herbie Hancock, for example. Like early Herbie like a lot of that is just so swinging. Maybe you say a little bit of it sounds like, well, maybe a lot of it is just bouncing like Wynton Kelly, and like maybe you listen to early Brad Mehldau and it sounds a lot like Bud Powell, or like they're coming from somewhere, but at the same time, you hear them just break off and become their own. I wouldn't say completely their own. They're never really their own, but a very distinct voice from doing a lot of homework, and also having the courage to respect and break the rules at the same time. It's really unique. Mm-hmm.
I think that goes back to, I was watching an interview with you where you were talking about a project you did a little while ago called Doorways, and you gave an example of when you were in college, your teacher played a Bach piece, and then he played like a stridey jazz piece, and then combined the two where there were like these jazz changes, but he was doing Bach lines over it. And I just had such a moment, then also listening to you play Impressions and the way you were approaching it, of like, it's so important, like you say, to do the homework and to have a home base. And it almost doesn't matter what your home base is, but you need a home base, because then you have a framework and a structure, and then you can assess how to break the rules from there. Then you can assess how to grow and how to be your own person. And I think you just illustrated that example too, talking about listening to guys like Brad, listening to guys like Herbie, going back, where you can clearly hear the influences, and then they have that foundation, and then the personality really starts to come through.
Yeah, man. Yeah, totally. And there's so many artists that continue to do that. And it's not like they stop at any point, checking out all of those great artists that came before them. It's like, that's just like a continual thing, Like take like Thelonious Monk, for example, like a lot of the modern groups that are just like continually inspired by Monk. It's kind of interesting to hear, like John Beasley. Have you checked out a lot of his stuff? He's
no, I've not.
It's basically an orchestra that's inspired by Monk, but like they throw down, man, like pocket funk,
check it out.
A lot of Afro Latin inspired stuff. Like it's really is amazing, and it's coming from Monk. Or take like Fred Hirsch, also his interpretations of Monk, or Danilo Perez, his interpretations of Monk. Like it's really interesting seeing where the foundation is, and then how people springboard from it. Yeah, it's interesting.
So for anyone listening to this, and for whatever reason they've made it to this point in their life without having exposure to Thelonious Monk, Kevin Harris, what would your 3 tracks that someone needs to go listen to be for Thelonious Monk?
Oh, wow. That's tough, man. That's a toughie. Let me see. I mean, there's a great album. It's Monk Live at Town Hall, and that's one of my favorites. There's a trio album where he covers all of Duke Ellington's music. So you kind of get to hear Monk filter tunes we know played in a certain way by Duke, but filtered through in this kind of, Monk way, which is always really interesting.
Yes.
And, man, Monk playing solo piano is some of the best stuff in the world. You get to hear the tradition. How do I say this? You get to hear the tradition of piano playing. In a way that I would have to chalk it up to like Mary Lou Williams inspired him, because Mary Lou Williams, probably even more so in her playing, you can hear ragtime, you can hear stride, you can hear rent parties, you can hear swing, bop, funk, and she would tell you, and you can hear that influence on Monk, so I think that third album would be, I think it's another live album that happens in San Francisco. I can see him on the front of the album. He's like on one of those trolley cars. But I don't know if that's the exact name of it. But it's, that'll get people in the right direction of it. It's a great album.
One more fun question before we get back to plugging your stuff. Mm-hmm. What degree of correlation, correlation is not the right word, but what degree of connectedness and spirit do you see between Beethoven and Monk?
That's a great question. I don't think I've ever been asked that question before.
I only thought of that question just now. But do you see what I'm saying about that?
I think when I think of Beethoven, I mean, here's someone who, I mean, had to work really, really hard. I mean, not most musicians have to work really, really hard to get a specific sound, you know, as a composer. And obviously there's the health, you know, especially audio wise, that he was dealing with as his development as an artist continued to progress. I think I would compare the two, like development wise. I think earlier Monk sounds a lot more like kind of stride piano. You listen to early stuff and it just, you know, you don't even, what people categorize as Monk, sometimes they don't even know that's Monk. You know, there's some old recordings, some sessions, him playing sessions at Minton's Jazz Club. But it's not the Bach that we usually associate with Dizzy and Charlie Parker. It doesn't sound like that. He's not playing like that. And so his development, I kind of see earlier. And then in Robin Kelly's book, The Life and Times of an American Original, there's a few times where people ask Monk about his, you know, his style. And he'll say, you know, I'm changing it all up right now. You know, there's people trying to steal my style. I'm completely changing it up. And in many ways he does. It becomes more dissonant, you know, the Monk that we tend to associate with.
Yes.
But Beethoven, on the other hand, from what I know, I mean, I've checked out a lot more Monk than I have Beethoven. But Beethoven, you know, just continues to, like, even towards the end of his career, like, that continues to become something more and more fresh and new, you know. I think Monk's playing, I always see it becoming fresh and new, and his compositions were constantly changing. But towards the end of Beethoven, up until the end, I feel like he's becoming something even more palatable or unpalatable, depending on who you are, you know. But that's only from what I know about Beethoven, you know. Like, you know, Monk, I feel like another thing about Monk is he was so well rooted and grounded in a tradition, but in his own style, he was so rooted in that being right that over time people had to adjust to that. So with Monk, I'm not sure if I'm more focused on him developing or people evolving around an anchor that just kind of allowed everybody else to adjust to him, you know. So I think I'm, you know, articulating that somewhat coherently.
Yeah, I think so too. You know. I think what I was getting at too was that established in a school, established in a style, but then breaking it. So just thinking about like times where Beethoven does things melodically that are just like completely just might make you laugh out loud because they are just so cleverly against, perhaps I'm projecting, but they're so cleverly against the rules of what has been established. And when you listen to the rhythm of Monk, it is so cleverly against the rules that have been established that there's almost this like rebellious thing that and again, perhaps I'm projecting, but this rebellious thing in both of them that I think we're both getting at the same thing. It's that you're established on a thing and then you go, yeah, well, you know what? I'm going to do this my way.
Yeah, which is very hard to do. You know, there's always going to be critics. There's always going to be the fact that, you know, if you want to, you know, kind of, if you value being accepted, which most people do, you know, then that will determine
artistic outcomes.
Yeah, it does, or at least you having to weigh what is important. You know, like Beethoven and Monk both had to weigh, regardless of what these critics are saying. There's some things I'm going to continue to do. I'm going to weigh that. I'm not. You know, that's a tough gig that we all have to do. You know, I mean, everybody's got opinions. So, yeah.
That's an incredible insight. That is really cool. Just the result on the actual artistic choices because of sort of group identity to a musical culture. Like, whoa.
Yeah.
That's wild.
On this album that I think you were kind of alluding to, there's actually two. There's Shift, and then there's another album that I'm also working on, a little longer term project called Embers. And I have a song on there called Beyond Gravity. And it kind of has to do with what we're talking about right now. You know, the opinions of, you know, important opinions, family, close friends, you know, folks you know well, folks you've never seen before in your life, you know, are all going to have opinions, you know, and but like breaking from that gravity is very, very important, you know, like it kind of, there are some rules and traditions that are good, you know, just to have, you know, to know that this is coming this time of year, or, you know, whatever, this time of the day I'm going to have this cup of coffee or whatever.
Yeah.
Or, but to acknowledge there's a gravity that keeps you in place. Like, are you anchored by that? Do you actually have a freedom? If you feel like not being anchored by it, how much freedom do you really have, you know, to get beyond that gravity?
And how will you leverage that gravity? Like when they slungshot that Apollo mission around the moon, using the gravity of the moon to get them back to Earth because like they're going to run out of oxygen or fuel or something. It's like, how do you leverage? Like, how do you look inside yourself and see your own proclivity to bow to the expectations of others, and then almost judo throw yourself in a creative moment around that and actually use that for more leverage? It's fascinating.
Yeah. And you know, speaking of judo, which means like play, like back and forth, right? Like I never want to project I'm going to do my best not to project the opinion that it is also very beneficial to be grounded for a long time. You need to be held down until you understand what it is so important, you know, that's kind of holding you there. That it really is a balance. It really is, you know. Friedrich Nietzsche, he has this quote that I love, and he says that the higher you soar, the smaller you will appear to those who cannot fly.
Ooh.
And I don't think he said that like in a very arrogant way, like I'm flying, you guys chumps. You know, I don't think it was like that type of thing. I think it's like, you know, the more you are trying to grasp and hold on and work hard towards a certain sound or dream or vision, it's kind of like soaring, like breaking away. And there's always going to be somebody that's like, can't you just do things the way everybody else does them? You know what I mean? Like, why you got to make things so complicated, you know? So, yeah, it's definitely a balance, yeah.
We have very interesting biological mechanisms in all of our brains that make us want to stay inside of things that are familiar and stay inside it's a survival mechanism. We want to stay in. Our brain relates it to things that have nothing to do with survival, like art, which would obviously be very high up on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That's, you know, you've taken care of shelter, you've taken care of food, all that good stuff, and then you're able to express and self-fulfillment, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh. Man. Well, Kevin, I'd love to keep on rattling on with you for about 2 hours, but we have a limited time here, so I'm gonna keep the conversation moving and grooving. Sure. We talked about your project Shift. I also do want to mention your project Doorways for people to go to check out. It just in concept was so fun just to watch the idea and to hear the inspiration, and how the inspiration was a combination of like you and your wife walking through this museum and the conversations. And a lot of times art can be this really ephemeral thing where it just kind of happens, and sometimes there's a real grounded story behind it, and it's such a fascinating project. And for anyone who's interested, and I recommend everyone who is listening to this to get interested, we'll have a link in the show notes if you're on audio, or in the video description, to check out the full interview. At the end you can hear the entire piece. But just to bring our first conversation home here, the piece you play is not that long. You talk about, sure, it's a through composed piece, and there's different elements of it, just like as anyone who will see the Gardner Museum is very, I mean, not eclectic, but there are these areas of very different, there's these different feelings in these different areas, and you sort of capture that a little bit in the composition, but maybe you could talk for just a couple moments about your approach to doorways.
Yeah, sure. It's kind of as you mentioned, my wife and I, we were at the Isabella, and we were just kind of walking through different rooms on the second kind of tier floor. And I forget how she started the conversation, but somehow she had mentioned how special it was to just walk through the doorways and think about where we've come from, that room before, and just how the new room puts you in a different mindset. And so that gets me thinking, just kind of metaphorically, where do we come from, as just human beings, the last 5 minutes yesterday compared to tomorrow, or just, even like generationally, where do we come from? Where are we going? And how does right now, who we are, me and you right now, how is it influenced by, where we come from, where we're going to? So, it was fascinating. Another thing about that project musically is I tried to represent, at the piano as we go from this section to that section. I try to let that be somewhat representative of the rooms that you're going through. And yeah, it's short, the version that you heard, but the live performance that I gave ended up being a lot longer. So that's kind of the beauty of improvisation, and also being able to play to a specific concept like doorways, because that journey could be 7 minutes, it could be an hour, it's pretty open. So yeah.
To poorly paraphrase Miles Davis, play what it is you have to say, and then stop.
I have my piano teacher in Kentucky, who was my first piano teacher when I was still in Lexington. He would tell us, I want you to get up there, do your thing, then go sit down somewhere. That's my, that was that was the speech. And it was just, instead of getting all wordy about it, it's true. You've already put in the time. What you're doing is very important. You love it. A majority of us love what we're doing, So just go up there, you got a minute before you get out there, so there's not much you can do to change it. So just get out there, do your thing, then go sit down somewhere. It's like the best advice. You don't have to overthink it. You just do it. That's what you go out there and do.
Yeah, just do it.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And for anyone who's listening to this who's not aware of the Elizabeth Gardner Museum, it's this really, really incredible museum, and there's actually a documentary on Netflix about the Elizabeth Gardner Museum you can go check out. There's a very interesting, it was like a true crime documentary thing on Netflix about the museum.
Yeah, art heist. Mm-hmm.
Anyway, Kevin, like I said, I'd love to talk with you for like 3 hours, but we're coming up on time here. So we're going to do a rapid fire question round. So I'll keep the questions speedy. If you could keep your answers short, we'll get through this thing. You ready?
All right.
We're going to do it together as a team. We've got this.
Let's go for it, man. Yeah.
Okay. Do you think of yourself as a musician, a human who plays music, or something else?
I'm going to go with a human who plays music. Because sometimes I'm not playing music, but still human.
How do you define success in your career?
The impact. If it's inspiring other folks, I consider that impactful.
Well, may I say that I do find your music very inspiring. I also find it very uplifting, and it makes me feel good to listen to it. So I just wanted to share that with you. I really enjoyed listening to your music. How many hours of sleep do you need to feel no negative impact in your performance and creativity the next day?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I don't sleep a lot. So for me, probably about 5 hours. Yeah.
And then you're like good to go.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
But I should say, if those add up, I can only do that for like maybe 3 or 4 days, then I really need some sleep, just to like crash, and then my body's just been doing that for a long time.
Do you use mindfulness or meditation ever to impact performance or creativity?
Yeah, both, for sure. Yeah. I think the mindfulness part is something I'd like to practice to where that's just kind of always on, a light switch that's always on, because we need that, and when we can meditate or, pray, whatever people do, that's usually a morning thing for me. It's a little bit more quiet then, and for all of us, the phone starts ringing more and more, the day progresses and life just kind of builds a momentum that you're glad you meditated about.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Do you ever exercise? And if so, how do you feel that exercise impacts creativity and performance in the musical world?
Oh, yeah. So I run. There's a few, nothing too serious, but there's some 5Ks that I enjoy running. I run around my neighborhood here in Mission Hill, and there's something about that. Just one foot in front of the other. Just as tired as you are, as whatever's kind of on your mind mentally, it is a way to kind of train yourself to deal with adversity.
Yes,
or at least I feel like that. Because there's always over that hill, could kill you, or it feels like it's going to kill you. But instead of focusing on that all the time, it's just
one foot,
in front of the other. And we just want to do that kind of, symbolically in almost everything we do.
In the words of a Scottish poet, and I could walk 500 miles, and I could walk 500 more, just to be the man who walked with that. Anyway, do you have a time or times of day that you like to practice?
Probably in the morning, just piggybacking that time to just be quiet and think. If I get the chance, to practice it's usually in the morning time. Yeah.
How many hours a day do you practice now, and about how many days per week on average?
On those kind of, perfect days where everything is going your way, it's, getting in maybe at least 2 to 3 hours is like great. That's kind of, it allows me to get a lot of things done, but
Indeed.
Sometimes it gets busy and that's just not possible. But if I can get in 3 hours, focusing specifically on, a repertoire, probably getting ready for whatever projects or gigs, and composition. If those can be in there, I'm happy. Yeah.
What is the maximum length of an effective technique practice session? So not doing repertoire, like pure technique drills. Like what do you find your attention span on that to be?
I can go with those just forever. I can
because it becomes like a meditation.
In many ways it does. It technique is that thing that just needs to be,
programmed.
Like walking or eating with the spoon. It's a thing that you shouldn't have to think about, so you can actually communicate what's on your mind. So I've had times where I practice, and speaking of Netflix at the beginning of this conversation, where I'll just, I'll turn the volume and just like be barely there on a keyboard and just kind of, shed whatever while I'm watching. Again, that's the goal, is like you can get that together and, not have to be concerned about this and just kind of think where your muscles and everything knows it.
When you practice the most in your life, how many hours a day?
I chalk that up to about 6.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
If money was no object.
I'll say that there's a healthy 6 and a not so healthy 6.
Indeed. Yeah.
And most musicians know what we're talking about. Like if you just kind of go on and on without taking a break, or what you're practicing just doesn't have a lot of thought and understanding. You're just practicing to be practicing. That's, not so healthy. But just, thinking through what we're doing is...
Set goals. A little bit of thinking ahead of time will save you hours of doing time.
Breaking it down.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, money's no object. You've got $2 billion with a B, $2 billion in a bank account. It's all, you've paid your taxes on it. It's yours free and clear. Would that change your relationship to practice and to music?
Instinctively, I'd like to say no, of course. I think how I would want to get music to people with that much money would change.
Oh, yeah.
You know, how, you know, because we no longer have to kind of depend on this person, you know, to pay your flight to get you to, you know, wherever in Europe or, you know, wherever in South Africa or wherever, you know, like you don't have, that's not a factor anymore. So not only with my own projects would I use that new capital, but I'd like to say I'd be able to help out some other folks, you know. It's interesting you point that out because with some grants and these things, actually my wife, she's hosting a Mission Hill Arts Festival. I'm kind of like the, you know, I'm the co-director, but she's definitely to what you're talking about. You know, she's gone after grants and these things and figured out, you know, what we're going to do with it. So this is like the second year we're doing the Mission Hill Arts Festival. So I think that would be somewhere in the mix too.
Yeah, be able to really push art forward.
Yeah, right. You know, somebody did it for us. We wouldn't be here. You know, we didn't get here all by ourselves. Somebody helped out somewhere.
Kevin, I got about 7 more questions, but I know we're running late on time. Are you cool with the 7 questions you want to call it?
No, keep on going.
We got it? All right. Do you take any steps to stay creative or protect your creative space?
That's a good one. That's the same. That's a question that I talk to my students about and try to remind myself about too. I think being able to say, yeah, this gets back. Once you get to a point where you actually are able to keep a roof over your head and, you know, kind of those essentials, then the question is, how are you going to spend your time? And so being able to protect time is really, really important, you know. Yeah, you know, in the sense where you want to be a great, you know, a musician to where people are calling you to hear your music or to be a, you know, a side person or something like that. That's great. But that, you can find yourself more busy than you are being
productive.
Productive and playing the music that you really like, you know. So I think somehow being able to say, okay, you know, I'm going to kind of consolidate all of these things as to the best of my ability, you know, to create what I really love and not let that take over is really important.
Do you have a time or times of day where you feel the most creative?
Probably the morning. And that's at the piano. Now, once we start to play with other people, you know, and start to improvise, like that's just 24 hours a day, man.
Yes.
As a composer, I've never really felt hindered. Like hopefully I'm not jinxing this, but like writer's block has never been a big problem for me as a composer.
Do you think that has to do with the fact that you give yourself some? I mean, I think we could reasonably agree. You give yourself a balanced lifestyle. You're not going overboard. You're a human who plays music. You're not trying to be a musician 24/7. You're also having your you time where you're doing life. Do you think that balance has something to do with that?
I think the main thing that has to do with kind of like a lack of writer's block for myself is just not believing that it exists.
Oh, I love it. Oh, and people sign up. Dude, you know, that is amazing.
And let me just kind of talk about that a little bit, only because usually when an idea comes, it's not really our own. Victor Wooten has this great book. You probably checked it out. It's called The Music Lesson.
Love it. Yeah.
And somewhere in that book, he compares the idea of creating to being like a radio. Like how, like songs really aren't inside of a radio. But thousands, millions of them are, you know, picked up from wherever, frequencies are streamed through that, and they just keep on going. And I could not be more of a firm believer in that. You know, it's just like, from this conversation, there are so many things that inspire composition, you know, shapes, squares, colors, sound. But if you don't believe that, then, I mean, yeah, you probably have writer's block. But, you know, if you believe every one of those things inspires something, yeah, I'm a firm believer in that. And yes, that does mean when you sit down at your instrument, you're going to play some things that just don't sound good at first. But that doesn't mean it's not the beginning of something very, very unique. Just stick
or a
with
path to something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, man.
I'm not going to sully that incredible answer by asking a single question more. That was amazing. Kevin Harris, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to come chat with me. Check out Kevin at Kevin Harris Project on Instagram and kevinharrisproject.com for all new releases and super awesome projects. Kevin, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it, man. Have a great day.
Thank you.
All right, man. See you.